Depression has certainly increased. At all levels, the whole society is stuttering and falling apart. There is a great deal of division. People are talking about the possibility of civil war, that sort of thing.
This is the Lest We Forget podcast, a historical podcast by Tenement Yard Media. I'm Gabrielle, your host for this episode. This is the fourth episode in this season's coverage of the people, events, causes, and consequences that led to the 1979 Grenadian Revolution, which, fun fact, is the only successful revolution in the Anglophone Caribbean. In this episode, we chronicle the rise of the new joint endeavor for welfare, education, and liberation, the New Jewel movement, and the key leaders that allowed the organization to become the most popular opposition by the latter end of the 1970s. Just a quick content warning before we begin. This episode discusses and recounts instances of police brutality. Now that you're all caught up, let's get into it. In 1968, a young academic, after spending almost a year teaching in Tanzania, returned to the Caribbean. He was Dr. Walter Rodney, the famous Guyanese historian. At just 26 years old, Dr. Rodney would begin his stint as the first ever professor of African history in the Caribbean when he agreed to take up a faculty post at the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Kingston, Jamaica. However, even before the first official class could happen, the Jamaican government banned Dr. Walter Rodney from entering the island as he was returning from a writers' conference in Canada. A day after his ban, October 16, 1968, led by a then young St. Vincent and the Grenadines student Ralph Gonzalez, a protest over Dr. Rodney's status as persona non grata occurred. It would bring the streets of Kingston to a standstill, and the event, now known as the Rodney Riots of 1968, is still today the largest organized student protest in Caribbean history. Just a side note, Dr. Walter Rodney's ban is still in effect even up to this day in Jamaica. But to learn more about why he was banned by the Jamaican government and the Rodney Riots, check out our Season 2 episode titled The Walter Rodney Riots. You can also listen to our Season 3 episode about the 1969 banning of Dr. Rodney's compatriot, Dr. Clive Y. Thomas, by the Jamaican government. Now you might be wondering, what does Walter Rodney have to do with Grenada and its revolution? Well, unknowingly, the Jamaican government, when they banned Dr. Rodney, they created a slippery slope. So when the UWI students took the streets of Kingston, they subsequently rocked the very foundation of Caribbean politics and identity, and thus the Rodney Riots served as the trigger that set off the Black Power movement in the Caribbean. According to David E. Lewis, the Black Power movement in the context of the Caribbean is seen as the break with imperialism, which is historically white racist, the assumption of power by the black masses in the island, and the cultural reconstruction of society in the image of the blacks. As such, soon after the Rodney Riots, the Abeng newspaper would be formed in Jamaica and the Yulu United Liberation Movement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Then, a group of West Indian students organized a sit-in at Concordia University, which resulted in the largest student occupation in Canadian history. This event would become known as the Sir George Williams Affair of 1969 and would eventually lead the formation of the National Joint Action Committee in Trinidad and Tobago. This would spark the 1970 Black Power movement in the Twin Island country, which would have a profound impact on nearby Grenada. In early 1970, a demonstration to stand in solidarity with Trinidad and Tobago's uprising occurred and called for Premier Eric Gairy to provide jobs. Describing the demonstrators as hot and sweaty, 10 days later, Gairy would enact laws strengthening police powers and restricting the movement and assembly of people. He would then deliver a radio broadcast where he stated that Black Power has already been achieved in Grenada since 1951 and followed up on another message.
It is said that when your neighbor's house is on fire, keep on wetting your own house. We are now doubling the strength of our police force. We are getting in almost unlimited supplies of new and modern equipment. Opposition referred to my recruiting criminals in a reserve force. To this I shall not say yea or nay. Does it not take steel to cut steel? Indeed, hundreds have come and some of the toughest and roughest roughnecks have been recruited.
This reserve force that Gairy mentioned was the Mongoose Gang that we spoke about in the last episode. One of the organizers of the February 1970 demonstration was a young lawyer named Maurice Bishop. He and other young intellectuals returning to Grenada would seek inspiration from Trinidad and Tobago's Black Power movement to let Eric Gairy know that business would not continue as usual. Born in 1944 on the island of Aruba to Grenadians Rupert and Alimenta Bishop, Maurice Bishop moved to Grenada at the age of 6. An outstanding academic student, he received a government scholarship to attend secondary school. In a 1979 interview with Caribbean Life and Times, Bishop would state that it was while a schoolboy that he would meet Bernard Cord. We'll speak about him later. Both men would help form the Grenada Assembly of Youth After Truth, which was intended to create a relationship between the 4 main secondary schools on the island, where, according to Bishop, there was a lot of competition in a very foolish and sectarian way. He would leave Grenada in the early 1960s to attend university in the United Kingdom. Influenced by the writings of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, the philosophy of Frantz Fanon and Vladimir Lenin, events in Algeria, and the activities of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara during the Cuban Revolution, Bishop became involved with the West Indies Students' Union and the Standing Conference of West Indian Organizations. Bishop would go on to attend Gray's Inn and earn his law degree from the University of London. In 1970, upon returning to Grenada, Bishop passed through Trinidad and witnessed the Black Power movement live, and soon after would join with others to organize a Grenadian protest to stand in solidarity with the movement. In June of that same year, Bishop would help begin the newspaper Forum, which primarily protested the policies of Gairy and his government. The newspaper would go on to last for 7 to 8 months. But as we mentioned in the previous episode, Bishop's biggest test up to this point was the nurses' demonstration of November 1970. Around 30 nurses took part in a peaceful demonstration where they brought to light the conditions at St. George's Hospital. A larger protest erupted when the nurses were then joined by school children, youth groups, members of the Grenada National Party GNP, and trade unions. Previously, Gairy enacted the Emergency Powers Act in that same year, and this gave the police a great amount of power. As such, Gairy allowed for the police to tear gas, beat, and arrest the demonstrators. The nurses would eventually be acquitted after being successfully defended by a group of lawyers which included Maurice Bishop and Kenrick Radix. Kenrick Radix, Dix as he was widely known, was educated at Dublin University in Ireland and later qualified as a lawyer at London University in 1970. The nurses' demonstration would allow both Bishop and Dix to come in contact with other young progressive professionals in the region. This inspired them to organize, and so by 1972, Bishop and Dix formed the Movement for Assembly of the People, MAP. Soon after, they would come in contact with a young economist by the name of Unison Whiteman. Unison Whiteman was educated at Howard University in Washington, D.C., where he earned a bachelor's degree in government and then a master's in economics. Upon his return to Grenada, Unison, alongside 3 other young professionals, Fitzroy O'Neill, Selwyn Strawn, and Keith Mitchell, would run on the GNP ticket to contest the upcoming 1972 elections against Gairy and the Grenada United Labour Party GULP. They were not members of the party, they just ran on their ticket and even dubbed themselves the Committee of Concerned Citizens. However, they all lost to GLP candidates as Gairy claimed the 1972 elections. Unison, however, was not derailed, and by March 1972, he and a young man named Sebastian Thomas would meet up in the parish of St. David's to create JEWEL, the joint endeavor for welfare, education, and liberation. Late in 1972, an Englishman named Lord Brownlow barred public access to a popular beach by fencing the entry to the area through his La Sagesse estate. When the public complained to Gairy, it went unanswered, so they took their concern to JEWEL. JEWEL then organized the People's Trials, where the concerned public convicted Lord Brownlow of violating their rights. They went on to tear down the erected fences and marched to the beach. So by the time Bishop and Dix met Unison and Sebastian, it was MAP meeting JEWEL. Then by March 1973, both organizations, born out of a desire to challenge Gairy's premiership, would join forces to create the new joint endeavor for welfare, education, and liberation, the New JEWEL Movement. The New JEWEL Movement would then release a manifesto which addressed the people's concerns of high prices, low wages, unemployment, and the lack of social services. They outlined their plans to improve the aforementioned problems, and so in 1973, the New JEWEL Movement, unlike the GNP or GULP, was the only political organization with an actual economic and social plan to address Grenada's growing issues. Bishop had stated from the beginning that the New JEWEL Movement, NJM, was an unconventional type of organization. In his own words, it wasn't formed as an electoral political party, but was formed as a political party that was more aimed at raising consciousness and with the declared intention of taking political power in or out of elections if the accepted processes did not allow for electoral change. According to Bishop, the NJM wanted to change, to revolutionize Grenada's economy, its policies, and its society. Armed with the mentorship of Casademo Grant, a longtime associate of T.A. Marichaud, the organization would position themselves as a thorn in Gairy's side. However, Eric Gairy had influence over the police, the army, and of course his secret police, the Mongoose Gang. In April of 1973, a young NJM supporter, Jeremiah Richardson, was shot in the head by Gairy's police, and his family would take their concerns to NJM for help. The group organized a mass demonstration outside Grenville Police Station that forced it to close, and brought the same demonstration to Pearls Airport that forced it to close for almost 3 days. Of note, the murder of Mr. Richardson was just days after the April 5th 2-day strike of the Technical and Allied Workers Union, where workers called out Gairy's lack of concern over the workers' frustration. When Gairy announced his intention to get Grenada's independence, the NJM was skeptical. The group believed that Grenada's independence under Gairy would turn the man into a powerful political tool where he would use the country's new status for self-glorification to strengthen his tyranny and financial gain. As we found out from the previous episode, that was what came to pass. Still, on November 4 of 1973, the NJM organized a People's Conference on Independence, which saw almost 10,000, a quarter of the voting population, attend. This was the second one of its kind held by the NJM, as they held a previous conference in May. The purpose of this congress of some sort was to let Gairy know that the people did not support his method of independence. The public was not consulted. Those present would charge Gairy with 27 charges, ranging from incompetence to corruption to brutality. They then passed a resolution called the People's Indictment, which was sent to Gairy, all ministers in government and senators, calling upon them to resign with effect on November 18, 1973. Of course, Gairy did not resign. Instead, he went on the radio and delivered a speech with this message.
We will bring the NJM rebels to their senses and wake them up from their dreams in a very short time, for 54 reasons, including treason and sedition.
The short time would come soon. The New Jewel movement had a planned strike for November 18, 1973. On that day, NJM leaders were on their way to Grenville to have discussions with local businesses regarding said strike when they were pounced upon by Gairy's Special Reserve Police, the Mongoose Gang. The 6 men who led the NJM, Maurice Bishop, Unison Whiteman, Selwyn Strawn, Hudson Austin, Kenrick Radix, and Simon Daniel, were beaten all over their faces, heads, and bodies. By the end of the attack, they had serious injuries and were bleeding all over. They were then arrested and thrown in a small cell. 6 men who are no means small in stature in a 6 by 4 foot jail cell. To make it even more humiliating, the men had their heads shaved with pieces of glass, contributing even more to their injuries. They were then denied bail, refused medical attention and visits from their friends, families, and legal representation. This event would mark one of the darkest days of Gairyism and would become known as Bloody Sunday. Still, as bad as Bloody Sunday was, it portrayed exactly what the NJM had been saying for the past few months: the extremes of state brutality. As such, persons would publicly be outraged over the treatment of the leaders of the New Jewel movement. This would lead to the formation of the Committee of 22. As mentioned in our previous episode, the Committee of 22 was made up of the following organizations. Bear with me, it's quite a lot. The Civil Service Association, Technical and Allied Workers Union, Seamen and Waterfront Workers Union, Grenada Union of Teachers, Commercial and Industrial Workers Union, Progressive Labor and General Workers Union, Grenada Hotel Association, Chamber of Commerce, Masters and Mistresses Association, League of Concerned Citizens, Taxi Drivers and Owners Association, Law Society, JCs, a number of churches, the Gas Dealers Association, and the Lions Club, which was forced to withdraw after Gairy spoke with the regional president in Barbados. And with the NJM leadership in jail, the Committee of 22 decided that they would continue the planned strike. This strike, which started on November 19, was intended to bring those responsible for Bloody Sunday to be charged and to dismantle what was now turning out to be Gairy's police state. It would eventually force Gairy to appoint a commission to investigate the events of that dark day in Grenadian history in a legal event now called the Duffus Commission. The Duffus Commission is named after the widely renowned Jamaican legal mind Sir Herbert Duffus. In 1973, Sir Herbert Duffus had just finished his tenure as Chief Justice of Jamaica, a post he held from 1968 to 1973. He also served as Acting Governor General of Jamaica from February to June 1973. And now in December of that same year, Sir Duffus was hired by Eric Gairy in accordance with Grenada's Governor Dame Dr. Hilda Bino to head the investigation of the events surrounding Bloody Sunday. It would be a legal event called the Commission of Inquiry into the Breakdown of Law and Order and Police Brutality in Grenada, which is today dubbed the Duffus Commission. After almost 6 months of investigation and published in a nearly 230-page document, the Duffus Commission concluded: 1. The 6 members of the New Jewel movement visited Grenville only for the purpose of attending a meeting with businessmen. 2. The meeting was called for the purpose of discussing the participation of the business community at Grenville in the general strike proposed by the NJM in November of 1973. 3. There was no intention by the 6 members of the NJM to seize control of the Grenville police station by armed attack or otherwise. 4. There was no reasonable grounds for apprehending the possibility of such an attack. 5. There was no reasonable grounds for Assistant Superintendent Belmar to apprehend a dangerous attack on his person or on the Grenville police station by the 6 men. 6. there is no credible evidence to support the allegation that a rifle and ammunition were found in the possession of the 6 men. 7. The action taken by the police was not justifiable. 8. The action taken by the police was, in all the circumstances, a breach of the constitutional rights of each of the 6 men. And 9. The action taken by the members of the police force was not genuinely designed as a countermeasure taken by the government to meet any reliable allegation of any threats to the security of the state by the NJM or any of its members, but was instead a forcible action taken to suppress political opposition, which was genuinely believed to be likely to retard the progress of Grenada towards political independence. In his Reform and Revolution in Grenada 1950 to 1981, David E. Lewis states that from the Commission it is clearly seen that by November of 1973, quote, justice, law, order, integrity, honesty, human rights, political rights, and all the meaning of democracy had been cast by the Gairy regime. The Commission did outline a series of recommendations, one of which stood out. The police aids should be completely disbanded and never called into service. According to the Commission, the Mongoose Gang were an unlawfully constituted body of men. Eric Gairy, however, did not follow through with the recommendations, and the Mongoose Gang remained. However, Superintendent Belmar resigned, but would soon enter representational politics by becoming a minister in Gairy's government. Still, in the midst of the Commission's investigation, the NJM members finally got bail and were released from jail. Swiftly, they joined forces with the Committee of 22 and called a strike on the 1st of January. As we mentioned in the previous episode, this strike would cause the Grenadian economy to come to a standstill. All the unions on the island joined in: utility workers, commercial and industrial workers, and dock workers. Then, in a sea of chaos, on January 21, 1974, another event took place which would become known as Bloody Monday. On that day, violence plagued the streets of Grenada as persons protested the state of the country and police violence persisted. The strike was in full effect. A man stood on the steps of a doorway, arms outstretched. Behind him, women and children cower in fear as the violence raged on. The man was using his body to block the doorway of the building where women and children had taken refuge from the violence in the streets. Then, in the blink of an eye, the man fell forward. Police officers shot him as they marched forward towards the building. The man died on the spot. That man was Rupert Bishop, a local businessman on the island and the father of Maurice Bishop. One individual stated in a segment of Bev Sinclair's Time to Face the Facts that the death of his father in such a traumatic manner would leave a scar on Bishop's heart. Still, both days, Bloody Sunday and Bloody Monday, would cause great pain for the people of Grenada and showed how even though the country was days away from being independent, the very soul of the nation was moving towards a breaking point. Grenada would go on to achieve independence on February 7, 1974, and as predicted by the NJM, Gairy would use it as a powerful political tool where he used the country's new status for self-glorification to strengthen his tyranny and for financial gain. As we mentioned in our last episode, the years following independence, Grenadians and the rest of the world would bear witness to the country's economic deterioration and domestic repression. These were highlighted by the many cases of Gairy's bribes and corruption, real estate scams, extortion deals, sex scandals, international partnerships for his own self-interest, and his now growing obsession with religion and flying saucers. But even more alarming, they would have to wake up every day and come face to face with the reality that Gairy's secret police, the Mongoose Gang, would come down on anyone and anything that stood in his way of power, especially the NJM and their supporters. Casademo Grant would recall his experience while dealing with the group.
Gairy moved in with more and more army forces, and then the guns started firing. I was backed by 4 gunmen. But I passed through because I can't walk faster than a gunshot. There's no use of running.
Still, that did not deter the members of the NJM. Between 1974 and 1976, the New Jewel movement had expanded its programs of public discussions and connections with those at the grassroots level. At this time, it is safe to say that the party had local support groups in almost every village and town on the island. They branched out to create special arms of the party for women and youth. By this time, Gairy opposed the NJM messages of anti-neocolonialism and anti-capitalist rhetoric. As such, Gairy moved the island's only radio station under his personal control and passed a legislation requiring a permit for the use of loudspeakers. So, NJM went on to establish the New Jewel, the party's own newspaper. The editor of the newspaper was Selwyn Strawn, a union activist who founded the Grenada Agricultural and Factory Workers Union. But Gairy would not have it, and in 1975 he passed a law requiring a deposit of 20,000 Eastern Caribbean EC dollars for the privilege of publishing a newspaper. This was intended to close down the newspaper, however it only drove the newspaper underground and aided in its popularity. By 1976, the newspaper had a circulation of over 10,000 and was the most widely read publication on the island. NJM would go on to establish other newspapers. There was Fight, geared towards the youth and student population, Workers' Voice for urban workers, Cutlass, geared towards the rural population, and Fork, which was for farmers. There was also another newspaper which covered entirely women's issues in Grenada. By 1976, the NJM was rising in popularity among citizens, where the majority of the youth and women of Grenada were the core of their support. Another group that threw their support behind NJM was the Rastafarian community in Grenada. According to Arthur Newland in his paper, Rastafari in the Grenada Revolution, quote, "Without their grassroots support, it would have been difficult for the NJM to achieve success." With this support from the population, NJM decided to contest the 1976 elections. The elections, scheduled for December 7, 1976, was the country's first since independence. Wanting to cut Gairy's win as far as possible, the GNP and NJM joined forces in a coalition called the People's Alliance. But Gairy undermined the group's campaign. They were not given the right to choose their own election symbol, and the one proposed by the government only became available 3 weeks before the election. Then he would double down on the use of loudspeakers, where the opposition elements were frequently denied permission to use loudspeakers in campaigning efforts. This was not applicable to GULP candidates, however. It is key to remember that, as mentioned before, Gairy had control over the sole radio station on the island. There were also reports that he removed names of NJM supporters from the voter registration list while permitting GULP supporters to cast multiple votes. Then, due to neglect of the administration over the past 3 years to revise the voters list, the opportunity for persons to register for the first time was severely limited and their voting power reduced. To make things even worse, on the day of the election, there were reports of intimidation tactics by the Mongoose Gang towards voters. So despite all their efforts, the People's Coalition lost the election, but Gairy was in for a surprise, for he and the GULP only got 52% of the votes, 21,102, winning 9 of the 15 seats in Parliament. The People's Alliance received 48% of the votes, a count of 19,630, and won the remaining 6 seats, with the NJM getting 3, the GNP 2, and the United People's Party 1. The NJM became the official opposition in the legislature, with Maurice Bishop the leader of the opposition. At this point, Bishop, who had built up a reputation as the best defense attorney in Grenada, was vastly admired by the public. In his book, We Move Tonight, Joseph Hewitt Lane narrates a scene he witnessed during his time as a member of the NJM. He states, although all the speakers received warm applause from the crowd, Bishop was the main attraction. Indeed, he was always the main attraction at public or semi-public meetings. I remember him that night lighting up St. Patrick with his brilliant oratory. The sight of the masses rising to him as he denounced the corruption and abuse of power of the dictatorship is impossible to forget. With simple words which the smallest child could understand, he gave a vivid depiction of the Grenada NJM wanted to build. A Grenada summed up by the main slogan of the party, "Let those who labor hold the reins." And he called on the people to struggle to turn the dream of a jewel into a reality. The masses just loved him for such performances. His relationship with the younger generation was that of a committed and much admired brother, while the older folk, especially in the rural areas, related to him as a favorite son who had raised their nose several inches. So as they entered Parliament, the NJM, with Bishop as opposition leader, for the first time had a national arena where they could articulate their positions for Grenadians' development. It also provided the first step in playing a hand in changing the constitution. Just by their mere presence, the NJM would be catalysts to show how the whole process of Parliament in Grenada was a caricature of the Westminster model. 2 examples demonstrate this. The first was on May 25, 1977. Unison Whiteman made his contribution to a motion that was before Parliament. After Whiteman finished his contribution, Prime Minister Gairy demanded that he withdraw his statements made during the debate without stating what exactly he objected to. In the circumstances, Whiteman refused to consider the request until the specific statement was identified. This, Gairy refused to do. The Speaker, who we should note is a GULP Member of Parliament, paused the meeting in order to listen to the tape of the statement and to review Unison Whiteman's statements. When the meeting resumed, the Speaker stated that Unison should withdraw his statements, which Unison doubled down on wanting to know the exact reason why he should. This was backed by Bishop, who stated that Unison is entitled to know the objection of his statements. Then, Gairy and the Speaker moved a motion to suspend Unison from Parliament. Soon after, Unison was forcibly removed from the parliamentary grounds. The other instance took place in May of 1978, when the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association meeting was scheduled to take place in Trinidad and Jamaica. It is understood by all countries that the ruling party and the opposition are to send a delegation to these meetings. Gairy, however, despite numerous pleading from the other countries, refused to give the opposition a chance to name a delegate. Before we move forward, we have to mention 2 persons who had leadership roles in the New Jewel movement by 1978. One of them is Bernard Cord. At the beginning of the episode, we mentioned that Bernard Cord was a schoolboy friend of Maurice Bishop, where they helped co-found an organization to provide unity among the country's most elite secondary institutions. Bernard would go on to earn a master's in economics at the University of Sussex. He would return to the Caribbean region as a visiting academic at the UWI St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago. In 1974, he became an economics and international relations professor at the UWI Mona in Jamaica. Over the next 2 years while in Jamaica, he would join the Workers' Liberation League, which was the forerunner of Workers' Party of Jamaica, founded by the academic Dr. Trevor Monroe. Bernard would help in the drafting of the League's manifesto, which was grounded in communism. Upon returning to Grenada in 1976, he joined the NJM and would win a parliamentary seat in St. George's in the 1976 elections. The second person is Jacqueline Kreft, who still stands today as one of the region's most impressive policy enforcers and a celebrated feminist. Born in 1946 in Grenada, Jacqueline graduated from Carleton University in Ottawa with a degree in political science and returned home in 1971 and became involved in grassroots organizing. In January of 1973, she would take part in the La Sagesse protest we mentioned earlier. She was one of the foremost members of the New Jewel movement since its inception. In 1976 and 1977, Jacqueline lived in Trinidad and Tobago, where she became the regional coordinator for youth affairs in Christian Action for Development in the Eastern Caribbean, CADEC. In 1977, her Trinidad and Tobago work visa was then revoked and she returned to Grenada. However, according to the Free West Indian, she stated upon her return home that, quote, "Gairy refused to give me work, and as I was a new mother, I had another life to think about." Jacqueline had just given birth to her son Vladimir, and she sought employment elsewhere and would work in Barbados with the organization Women in Development. But by 1979, however, she was back in Grenada. It's 1978, and the Grenadian economy is in shambles with severe underdevelopment spread statewide. As mentioned in our last episode, wages for workers in retailing and manufacturing were $50 EC per month, while government ministers were paid $2,000 EC, and they paid no taxes. Unemployment reached 50%, food prices rose, clothing costs increased by 164%, and housing by 135%. Then, when agricultural production dropped by 25%, Gairy raised the taxes on imported goods like rice and flour, while allowing import monopolies to his friends, which allowed them to charge scalpers' prices. This meant, in the case of sugar, Gairy awarded sole importation licenses to only one person who made more than 100% profit on each 200-pound bag. Then, in the case of infrastructure, Gairy did little. The island's road systems fell into disrepair. Medical care was low in quality and extremely expensive as local doctors were scarce. The few medical clinics on the island were unsanitary and ill-equipped. Then in education, no new schools were built during Gairy's tenure. Primary school buildings deteriorated, teachers went untrained, while secondary schooling became a privilege and not a right. Gairy then stopped paying Grenada's dues to the University of the West Indies, and as such, citizens could no longer receive subsidized university training in the region. And in the middle of all of this, Grenadians had to deal with the news of Gairy's numerous sex scandals that took place throughout the 1970s, as it is said that he sexually exploited women who sought work in the public sector. Then in 1978, 5 persons who opposed Gairy's policies disappeared. Protests over this erupted, not only in Grenada, but the diaspora as well, for Grenadians in London would make their concerns heard. When the financial institutions started to feel the pressure, an executive member of NJM, Vincent Noel, would lead the process of forming the Bank and General Workers Union, BGWU. Gairy opposed this, of course, claiming that it was part of the NJM's plan to nationalize all banks. Still, over 90% of employees voted to be represented by the BGWU. Gairy then ordered a manager of Barclays Bank not to recognize the union. This goes to show how the working class and even persons in the public sector were moving away from Gairy. 1979. It would be 1951 Grenadian society all over again. However, this time, Gairy was the villain. because his years of leadership had resulted in a tense reality of Eric Gairy versus the people, and it could only be solved with social change. According to David E. Lewis, the difference between 1951 and 1979 Grenadian society was that, quote, in 1951 the British were willing to share power with Gairy on account of the threatening character of his movement to the status quo. But in 1979, Gairy was not willing to give up his hold over the state system without a struggle. Gairy unknowingly had created a revolutionary situation. The Grenada National Party GNP was falling lower on the national scene and was no longer seen as a recognizable and reliable opposition. It was the New Jewel Movement NJM, for their years of organizing, their relentless advocacy for youth, women, the working class, and the rural population, alongside their extensive public education program that was rising in popularity. During a segment of Bev Sinclair's Time to Face the Facts, Gloria Payne Banfield, Permanent Secretary for Planning in the Prime Minister's office during Gairy's term as Prime Minister, would say this.
I think that in 1976, when the general elections were called and the alliance won 6 seats, that was the beginning of the crumble, because before that the GULP had 14 seats. The only seat they didn't have was Carriacou, and they lost 5, and a great loss it was. So if the young people had waited a little while and had some patience, they might have won ultimately. But I don't think they wanted to wait.
According to historians Catherine Sunshine and Philip Wheaton, if there's anything the events after the 1976 election demonstrates, it's that, quote, Parliament was a farce, and that an electoral starter was useless for getting rid of Gairy. Disillusionment with the established model of change forced Grenadians to consider, for the first time, a more radical alternative. So on March 10, 1979, according to all persons who were personally involved in the documentation of the revolution, the NJM leadership got word through their informants at senior levels of the police force that orders were left for the arrest and assassination of the 8 leading members of the New Jewel movement. These were Maurice Bishop, Bernard Cord, Unison Whiteman, Kendrick Radix, Vincent Noel, Hudson Austin, George Lewison, and Selwyn Strawn. All members would go into hiding immediately except for Vincent Noel, who did not receive the information in time and was arrested and detained. Then, on March 12, 1979, Gairy departed the island on government business to attend a United Nations function in New York. The NJM members knew that if they wanted to live to see another day, they would have to act urgently. They had to move soon. And not just soon, they had to move tonight. And just like that, we're calling an end to today's episode. To view the sources used in this episode and/or recommendations to learn more about the topic, take a look at our website. It's tenementyardmedia.com. A transcript of this episode will be available 5 days after it has been posted to podcast outlets. And remember, we'd love to hear from you. Follow our social media pages at tenementyard_ on both Instagram and Twitter to view additional postings on this episode and updates on other content created by Tenement Yard Media. We're open to conversation about this and other episodes and all happenings around Caribbean history, politics, and culture. Just a quick note before we leave, we're over on Patreon at patreon.com/tenementyardmedia if you'd like to support the show with a monthly donation of as little as $1. You can also make a donation of your choice at tenementyardmedia.com. Until next time, I'm your host, Gabrielle, and this has been Lest We Forget, a historical podcast from Tenement Yard Media.